Episode 14, The Third Man. Hello all, I'm going to share with you a story that happened to me and my friend Duncan a few years ago. The channel asked me to categorise my story as part of the submission process. I had a hard time in doing so. I'd say that this story isn't really about a haunting, a ghost, or something paranormal in the traditional sense. The best I can say is that the events were supernatural or simply unexplained. There's no real sense of terror in my story, but I hope you enjoy it anyway, as it became a real-life mystery to me and my friend. To set the scene, I just graduated from university in Scotland. I'm English, but the course I wanted to do led me north of the border. I had 4 great years living there and met a number of friends for life. One of which was my friend Duncan. We were both fans of the outdoors. He was only 22 at the time, but he looked like he was in his 30s. He was rugged, bushy beard, and had a full frame. If you were asked to picture an outdoorsman, then Duncan was that image. In most photos I have of him, he's wearing some sort of backpack. We had met through the university's fell walking and mountaineering club. In total there were perhaps 15 core members, with another 15 that came and went on various outings. Typically, we would pile into a minibus and go out for day trips up in the mountains. Other times we might choose to stay for a night or two, camping on some of the lower slopes. Myself and Duncan graduated in September, but I planned to hang around for a bit, as I still had my apartment until the end of the year. I was waiting for news of my internship back in England. I was only working a temp job at the time, so had quite a bit of spare time. Duncan lived a few miles out of town, but we kept in contact. We had decided to go for one last hike up the mountains, a sort of farewell to our student days. Our other friend Dean had intended to hike with us, but due to work commitments had to pass on this occasion. He had kindly offered to drive the minibus though to drop us off and collect us. It wouldn't be ideal trekking with just the 2 of us, as a third person gives you more options in an emergency. However, the route we would take was not exactly considered risky. Our main enemy would be the weather. We set out not far from the beautiful Feshy Bridge. The plan was to walk through the forest, bypass Loch Enach, via Carnacreech, onto Breach, then onto Ben Macdui, via the Pools of Dee. From there, the plan was to pass over the majority of the Cairngorm range and end up in the village of Braemar, where we could easily be picked up by Dean. We were planning for around a 4-day outing. The only real must for us was to stand at the top of Ben Macdui, it being the Cairngorm's highest mountain. Our path would be relatively straightforward in terms of navigation, pretty much just keep heading eastwards towards the sun in the mornings, in the afternoons keeping the sun on our backs. As 2 experienced hikers, we set out as we always did, aware of the dangers but well prepared. We planned to spend at least 4 nights camped out in the open. In combination with the changing autumn weather, there were a few things to consider. Temperatures were likely to drop below freezing. We opted for a single 2-man tent between us to optimise the carried weight. We put emphasis on staying warm and well fed, with several decent base layers of clothing and reflective gear. Dean was of course aware of our trip. We had also informed the local authorities of our intended route. In summer you might share the mountain with any number of hikers. In the cooler months though, it's practically only other experienced trekkers that you'll see up there, if anyone at all. Our route lay both on well-trodden paths, as well as some more off-path shortcuts. The weather that day was not great at all. From halfway up the mountain we encountered near freezing temperatures, and a sudden covering of cloud rolled over us. We were not yet at Loch Enach, our intended camp spot for the night. Instead, with the light failing, we simply opted to set up our tent on the mountainside. There weren't many options that weren't out in the direct open. The scree underfoot also made it challenging to place the tent. We perhaps got a little lucky by finding a small, naturally formed stone outcrop, around 100 metres from our main path. We placed the tent next to it. This provided at least some shelter from the harshness of the wind. Now, bear in mind that up to this point, we had perhaps seen at most 5 or 6 groups of walkers all day, and these were almost all on the lower slopes. At around 10:30 p.m. in the darkness, in the cold and cloud-covered conditions, you should never expect to hear another human. It's just not the done thing to move around the mountain at night for any number of reasons, which I'm sure you can appreciate. But surprisingly, we did hear someone. We both heard a voice on the wind. It seemed to shout out, "For an air." In this context translates from Gaelic to something like "be aware" or "pay attention." We were obviously both inside the tent trying to keep warm and rest, so that we could set off at first light. We looked at each other in the dark. I didn't understand what the voice had shouted, so started to ask Duncan. He shushed me and strained his ears to listen. There it was again. "Thor an air." He turned on a lamp before answering me. It's Gaelic. Someone shouted, "Beware" or "look out." There must be a group lost on the mountain. As you might expect, Duncan had turned the light on to attract whoever it was out there. If they could at least find our light, we could help them. In the darkness, we certainly weren't in a position to go out and look for them ourselves though. It simply would have been too dangerous. On the basis that we could hear them shout in the first place, the person couldn't be too far away, even if the sound was carried on the wind. Duncan opened the tent door just a little and gave 3 long blasts on a whistle. He repeated this several times, listening in between for any response. Nothing came back. No voice, no light, no whistle. We tried intermittently over the next hour, but there never was a response. For safety, we were resolved to staying in the tent. Leaving to explore would have been a huge risk due to exposure and the dense cloud cover. I don't think either of us thought anything supernatural about the event. We had no reason to. We both heard the shout at the same time. We were more concerned about whoever it was left out there on the mountain. Come morning, we saw no sign of any person due to the snowfall. Morning came and we traced ourselves back to the main path to Loch Enoch. We stopped for some time to eat and refill our water, looking out over the loch before continuing up the slope to Carnacree. This was definitely walking pole conditions. Snow bellowed across the scree. As a precaution, Duncan even ensured that we were tethered together, should one of us get lost. Of course, we spoke that day about the voice we had heard last night. We could only conclude that if they survived the night, they would know how to follow a river path or due direction to hit civilization again. By late evening, the conditions were improving. There was still snow underfoot, but it was no longer falling. Both myself and Duncan, though, had an uneasy feeling. We hadn't seen another living soul all day, other than one couple heading west at the loch. The uneasy feeling was that we were not alone. It was sort of that feeling of being left alone in a church. Despite it being quiet and an open environment, somehow we could feel eyes upon us. I brought this up with Duncan first, and he agreed that he had had similar feelings that day. He did, however, offer explanations of mild mountain sickness or perhaps even inner ear changes caused by the cold wind. Either way, we both felt it. For me, though, it almost turned into what I can only describe now as a type of paranoia. I kept turning to see if someone had been following us up the mountain. As experienced hikers, I told Duncan that we might be sharing a third man syndrome, similar to that experienced and documented by Ernest Shackleton. It's a sort of hallucination where mountain walkers can experience a third man present, despite there being no one there. T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland captures the experience well. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded, I do not know whether a man or woman. But who is that on the other side of you? Usually though, this happens in very rare cases, all of which the hikers usually have been walking for some time. We had been out for less than 2 days. Yet it felt very real to us. As much as we tried, we just couldn't put the feeling to one side. We were now well on the way to ascending the mountain of Brearich. We wouldn't make it to the exposed top by nightfall, so once more we decided to set up camp on the mountainside. Brearich was far from the most dangerous part of the hike so far. The view from the top is stunning on a clear day, but it's a hell of a hike in poor conditions. Lots of loose stone underfoot, and it's easy to get turned if you don't use the well-documented paths. I was more than happy to get set up for the night. Somehow, things just seemed more secure once you're in a tent for the evening. We hadn't seen anyone for hours and didn't expect to. We were slightly off the path, and it was highly unlikely that we would see anyone else that night. But sure enough, we heard a shouting in the darkness once again. The voice was nearer this time. It cried, "Chiliach." I don't speak Gaelic myself, but there were some other words in there too that the wind took, I think. Duncan translated it as a message to go back. This time we did not put the light on, nor blow the whistle. We both had a sinking feeling that it wasn't the person shouting that was in trouble. We slept poorly that night and discussed our plans at first light. Both of us had an unspoken understanding that we should cut our hike short. This could easily be done by cutting out the path to the pools of Dee, instead taking the more direct route to the top of Ben Macdui. In these conditions, we reasoned that it would take most of the day to descend Brearich. We would camp in the valley that was reasonably well sheltered. We could then ascend Ben Macdui in a day via a reasonably well-trodden path. It was steep and straggly, but we had it in us. From there, we could hike due north via a well-trodden path to the mountain railway, all the way to Glenmore village, where an organised campsite and warm pub would await us. We set off at first light to reach the summit of Brearich, just a short walk ahead. As a bonus to our journey, we saw what's known as a Brocken spectre in the mist of the mountainside we had just climbed. The low sun from the east casting elongated shadowy ghosts of ourselves in the rolling mists below. Duncan was a man of few words, but even he couldn't resist joking that perhaps they were the lost ones. We descended Brearich with confidence and camped in the valley below that night as planned. The day after, we ascended to the very top of Ben Macdui in a single day. Not bad for the conditions. It was now misty rather than snowy. There was no sign of disembodied voices either in the day or night time. All we had to do now was the easier leg to the Cairngorm mountain railway, perhaps just 6 to 8 kilometres as the crow flies across the elevated slope. This is where things started to go wrong for us. Bear in mind we still had enough food and were in good spirits. All we really needed to do was to walk north and link up with the mountain path. We would even be able to look down on the pools of Dee that we missed earlier in the trip. However, we found ourselves lost on the mountain top that evening as the sun dipped below Brearich to our left. Deciding to call it a day as the light faded and more mist rolled in, we decided to put up the tent. We pulled out the tent just as a freak gust of wind took it. In seconds it flew over a ridge into the mist, never to be seen again. We couldn't chase it for fear of falling ourselves. We both knew the seriousness of the situation, either find shelter or face the exposure of the night elements. Sticking closely together, we ventured to at least find some shelter, no matter how small. Our fallback solution would simply be to wrap ourselves, including heads, in all the clothes we had on us. Then lay together in any form of windbreaking formation that we could. By this time we were starting to feel the effects of exposure. It was now completely dark and a driving snow was falling. It was clear that we had no option of continuing. We were of enough mind that we could easily stumble down a ridge or worse if we ventured further in the darkness. Just at the point that we were looking to settle down, wrap up, bury ourselves in scree rocks and take our chances, we heard something on the wind. It was a whistle. Somebody had found us. We followed it blindly until we stumbled upon a stone wall. By chance, we had discovered a bothy. For the listener's benefit, a bothy is a sort of simple shelter. They come in a range of constructions but are essentially either makeshift stone shelters or small log cabins. Typically in this part of the world, they are small stone buildings with a simple roof to keep travellers dry. Bothies are very basic, nothing more than a stopping off point for hikers. No water, no electricity, etc. Typically just a place to shelter from a storm or bed down for the night. They're essentially just small abandoned buildings that are free to use. That night, this one probably saved our lives though. We pushed back the door and rushed in so that we could close it as soon as possible to keep the snow out. As we listened to the worsening wind outside, we lit one of the candles that had been left in there. The stone room was practically all there was. There were 2 wooden benches that could double as beds, the candles and a box of old matches. It had an ancient feel about it. Sometimes you would find a guest book for visitors to sign. There was none though. Myself and Duncan simply hunkered down after warming our hands on the candle and prepared a very simple meal. If it hadn't been for that bothy, we would most likely suffered severe hypothermia, or at worst perished in the snow that night. Neither of us could understand how we had found the place, but we were more than thankful we did. We left the building the next day, leaving behind 2 Kendal Mint cakes as payment and a gift for the next occupants. After consulting our map and compass, with the weather easing, we did make the trek to the Cairngorm Mountain Railway as planned, then on to Glenmore. When we were back at the safety of a pub, a strange thing happened. We checked our map to try and understand at what point we had gotten lost on the mountain. We couldn't be sure. What was evident though was that no bothies were registered in that part of Ben Macdui, the nearest being 3 kilometres away. And this certainly wasn't a new structure, so would have been on any register or any map of the area. To this day, we are still at a loss as to its exact location, and even more so on how we discovered it that night. I can't truly explain what happened that week. Somehow, to both myself and Duncan, it felt as if someone was looking over us, keeping us safe. It was a trek that always was supposed to have a third man. Just maybe it did. If you enjoyed this week's paranormal story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. Until next time, my friends, happy hauntings.